Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, Strange Labor, a post-apocalyptic tale like none other. Rob Penner joins me in the studio to talk about it. Welcome.
Thanks.
So a lot of times I talk to authors about like world building, but this is maybe the first time I've had to ask about like world destroying.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's world deconstruction, sort of. There's a small element of world building, I suppose, but I don't venture much beyond just the core ideas. No one's phrased it quite like that, and I don't think that's necessarily always the case for sort of post-apocalyptic dystopias, that it is world destruction. But in this case, there was very much an effort being made to unravel a specific sort of economic and political kind of environment.
So then the genesis for you of the idea of like this, economic destruction, this, environmental destruction, was there a specific inciting incident or something that kind of like triggered this?
Yeah, probably just a stress dream about work.
Oh, really?
I'm assuming it was a stress dream about work, but there was just a dream about people wandering out of cities and starting to dig mazes. And I'm assuming, that's a reaction to sort of work environment and
Do you
so on.
have a notebook beside your bedside?
No, I regret it constantly, and that's not going to change at this stage in life, I don't think. But it was one of those dreams that stuck with you, and then because I knew it would amuse my partner, I immediately told her, and so then it's there in your mind. And I was probably sort of between stories. It was initially a short story, so I was probably between short stories, and I was like, well, I'll just play around with this and see what happens.
So it starts as like a dream that then becomes an anecdote that you tell your partner.
Right.
And then in the telling, you realize there's maybe grist for the mill here?
Yeah, like a solid story.
Yeah.
And so I was writing a lot of short science fiction at the time. So then I wrote the story. And then she was like, she was pushing me to write a novel. And she particularly liked that piece, and it hadn't been picked up anywhere. So then I just turned it into a novel. So I guess it's pretty layered.
So was the short story like one piece of what became the novel, or was it a very like compressed version of what the novel is?
It's a curious situation because it was actually probably more or less the last chapter.
Oh.
So it's changed in time quite a bit, but I wrote it as the last chapter. I mean, I wrote the story. It had a really sort of empty space in the foreground about what happened, but it begins at a fairly specific moment in the story, and then when I reconstructed it as a novel, the last few pages are pretty much from that short story, and then just all the backspaces just filled up. So it was a curious situation, which I don't think most writers have the luxury of the ending and you can write to it, which makes things actually relatively easy in terms of plot construction.
I was going to ask whether having an endpoint is an unusual thing for you as a writer.
Yeah, it is, and it was nice. It really gives you a sort of narrative discipline. You're less likely to wander off in digressions where if you're writing from a beginning and you have a vague idea of where you want to end up, you can get lost.
So in this, you're not Miranda. You're not like wandering.
No, I knew where I was going.
Yeah.
I knew where I was going. So, yeah, I don't know if there's any. I don't think there's a character that quite captures it in the book. But no, it was it was all mapped out pretty early on. It was a little episodic, maybe. I mean, that was maybe something that happened that was a little problematic. It's more like the Odyssey or something where it's pretty episodic rather than following a really rigorous sort of narrative arc.
How conscious are you of like that structural sense when you're writing? Like, is that something that you're thinking, what am I doing? Where are they going? Or do you write and find out where they're going as you're telling it?
I'm a very impressionistic writer, so it takes a fair amount of discipline really to impose sort of these sort of industry standard arcs on the work. Certainly in short form, I pay very little attention to sort of traditional structure. I just play around and do what I want. But when you're trying to get a novel published, you have to sort of at least create a basic spine, I think, to entice a publisher or an agent.
So you've got the sections and then the chapters within sections. Is that something you kind of have to like build in for like publishing purposes?
In this instance, No, I wouldn't say I had to build it in. So I knew where I was going. I knew that I should probably have like a 3-act structure rather than just like doodling my whole way to the end. And so in that sense, I was filling up sort of established space, but that's not how I usually write. Usually it's much more impressionistic. It's more scene building and sort of emotional and impressionistic. But in this instance, because I had that target, it was actually quite easy to just say, well, I'll just do a 3-act structure, and I know what my 3rd act is. I know what the punchline is.
So if you know what the 3rd act is it a different way of figuring out the beginning because you're not starting from the beginning?
Yeah. And I'm not sure that's not a common situation, but certainly it was just a question of, okay, where do I begin with Miranda at what moment? And one of the things I liked about the short story was the readers just dropped into it. So I wanted to do the same with the novel. So even though it's like quite a bit of backstory before you get to that final chapter, I mean, you are just dropped into it, and everything you know about the world prior.
Yeah, I was very curious about kind of like rather than either like writing right as like, you know, the depopulation happens as like, you know, events transpire. It's already happened, and what we glean about it is told after the fact,
right?
When Miranda encounters other people and they're relating, "Oh, where were you when it happened?" kind of thing, right? Like it's very much like reminiscence rather than like, you know, a visceral like I'm experiencing it over Miranda's shoulder.
Right.
How intentional was that?
It's pretty intentional. One of the things I was really interested in that story in particular is the sort of constructions of the past and constructions of meaning. So, I mean, you have these people that are put in pretty much an incomprehensible situation. And so more than, and there was some sort of reviewer, I wouldn't say backlash, but dissatisfaction with this. So rather than explaining the situation, I'm more interested in saying, okay, there's this basic situation where there's this incomprehensible event and how do people respond to it, right? So in that sense, it was tailor-made for my interests at the time. By dropping her in there, it's just everything gets constructed either via her immediate memory or the stories and conversations people tell in the story to explain events.
You know, I'm just thinking of this now because like this book is obviously, I mean, it's titled Strange Labor. Labor's in the title. Workers don't always know the overarching decisions that factor into like the work they have to do.
Right.
In the same way, like Miranda like doesn't know how this transpired and just has to like live in the world that exists and make do with that. And like, is there some sort of sense of like, yeah, we don't have a big picture idea of like how this happened, but none of us do if we're, you know, in a working role very often.
Yeah, no, I think in that sense it was pretty allegorical, right? That it's, I mean, I wasn't setting out to write an allegory, but that's to me, that's the experience of life, is that you find yourselves in these situations and there's kind of the rubble and the refuse and the ruins of the past around you, and you make sense out of them as best you can. But my outlook's fairly existential. It's like, I mean, all you have to work with are the stories people tell you and the narratives they give you themselves to make meaning or to construct meaning out of your own life. And that's exactly what's happening to Miranda in the story, in a sense, is she's just presented with this. And I guess you could call it a myth about the experience of being alive in late stage capitalism, right? You're not in a factory making things. You don't really know, I mean, how the economy works or what's happening financially, and certainly increasingly with things like algorithms buying stocks at high speed. It's like a lot of meaning is beyond us, and we're just left with what we can see within our immediate horizon.
And then what meaning we're able to scratch out for ourselves is very small versus like when you pull away, stuff's happening that's like, I don't understand this.
Yeah. It's like the opposite of sort of a Carl Sagan explanation of the universe. It's much more, it's a micro-history in a sense of just experience. And I mean, that's my background's history, and that's my experience of life too.
So then how important was getting like the specific person to go on this journey with, right? Like Miranda, like how much thought did you give to like her personality, how like she would inhabit the world and then face this?
In the initial story, I had the characters of Miranda and Dave in the story. So they're the two main characters. Miranda's the main character, and she has this friend, Dave, who's quite different from her and is a storyteller. And I can't recall now at what stage in the development it happened, but I knew I wanted that contrast of personalities. and once it was there, it was fairly easy. I think one of the things I did with Miranda as the story developed was I maybe made her a little more odd, a little more overtly distinct in terms of her personality and how she interacted with people from the societies she moved through, like a little more awkward, maybe. So that was a development. Why? I mean, I think in contrast to Dave, it was pleasant because Dave is so personable and outgoing and easy to get along with. So it was nice to have a quiet observer watching everything. And at the same time, Dave gives you a little more dramatic space for interacting with other communities and people.
Yeah, Miranda's very insular. Like,
yeah, that's the word.
She's an introvert. And so I think, like, you know, personality-wise is equipped to, like, deal with a post-apocalyptic situation where society, like, just disappears and she's on her own. Like I think she's somewhat content, right? Like, going around reading books, finding what food she can, that she's okay with that. But I don't know if, like, for you to tell a story, if it's an entirely interior, how well that works. You kind of need her to run into Dave and be, like, kind of pulled out of her shell a bit.
And I think that's right, and it wasn't planned. Maybe it was instinctive, right, that you need this character, but it certainly worked, for me, very well. And it also made it easier to imagine a backstory for Miranda as well, because you have such a concrete personality that it is so insular, as you say. It also helps you think about, okay, what are her initial responses going to be, right? And the other thing you mentioned is that she is very well equipped to deal with sudden social isolation, which isn't something I'd been thinking about. But you start writing it and you're going, oh yeah, this personality is in some ways perfect for this environment because she will just get on with it and take care of business.
It does make her, I want to say, like, not like uncaring, but she, is quick to pull the plug.
Right.
And I was curious about, like, particularly the first section, there's, like, elder care kind of is something that's broached and like brought into the situation. And whether, like, that was something on your mind about, kind of like people's capacity to look after older generations, because as obviously we're going to have more and more older people who are living longer, like personality wise, what equipment people have, like, mentally to deal with that.
It was in the air. It was certainly, there was a lot of conversation at the time about generational and demographic change and who's going to be responsible. That scene where she kind of walks away, I found it troubling when I wrote it, and I didn't want to change it. It didn't seem entirely out of character, and I thought from a purely aesthetic perspective, it was going to push certain buttons and create certain emotional responses to kind of intensify reader experience. So that's why I guess I did it. But it did. I got to admit, it did bug me, and I was, like, worried, like, how are people going to respond to Miranda? But I feel like, I'd already made it clear that there was a sort of emotional distance between her and other people.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that she's selfish in any way, but I think just she recognizes situations and she decides, what do I want to invest in this situation? What can I afford to invest in this situation? So in that sense, it's very much, I guess, about growing social concern about what are we going to invest.
Right. And so, like, her ability or, like, her personality allows her to make that choice, but maybe, you bristle at that choice. Obviously, if you have do you second guess what you have your characters do, but because it's maybe not in keeping with you yourself would do, but, like, works within their character?
Not at a personal level.
Okay.
It's like, oh, okay, she's doing that, and it's a little distressing as you're writing it. Sometimes you write about distressing things. The one concern is like, well, is it going to be, if I want to market and distribute this text, how's that going to play, right? So there was some sort of neurotic angst about it, but on a personal level, I'm gonna write where the story takes me, and I have emotional responses, but that's great in a sense that I feel like I'm writing well enough that I'm triggering my own responses, then that's good.
And it obviously, like, necessitates, like, her leaving is the reason she meets Dave.
Right.
Like, you can't essentially have that happen.
And in a lot of ways, it would have been a much more depressing story if she had stayed, right? Because then it's also, she throws off social weight with ease in a way that other characters can't. And in a sense, that's the whole point, that she can do that she can step away and say, well, I'm not actually responsible, right? Or I am responsible, but I'm choosing to move away from this situation because I can see what's going to happen and I don't like it. In that particular scene, I guess if you were going to, weigh the ethics of it, I mean, she also had an obligation, right, to try and find her parents, right? So that's also something that matters. So there's also that in the conversation. What do I owe to these people I don't know versus what do I owe to my parents, right?
Yeah, and she kind of quiet quits. I just realized, like, she's, doing it that way. So then, Dave comes into the story. Is it exciting or energizing to then have someone who is a different personality that, like, is going to, like, challenge Miranda, like, to, like, take your central character and push against them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's always a very exciting moment, and it really helps thinking through a character, too, to have her interacting with different types of people. So from just purely the mechanical point of writing a story, having multiple characters and having someone appear in a narrative actually really, really helps enrich a character to the point where you go back and you rewrite things because you're suddenly understanding more about the mechanics of her personality. And Dave, and I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but the woman she was living with just before she met Dave, both of those characters were very, very exciting to me because they did sort of throw a light on Miranda that you don't have when it's just an isolated individual moving through a post-apocalyptic landscape, which is pleasant to write. But once you have that more complex social interaction, things do change dramatically, and it is very exciting.
So Dave's kind of an amateur folklorist.
Yeah.
What led you to that as kind of like one of his pursuits?
The short answer is I just wanted a way to put more stuff in the story. So there's a sequence fairly late in the book where he just makes a list of different post-apocalyptic types. Mm-hmm. Right? And that really energized sort of falling on itself prose where you just cram lists of things together is something I like and enjoy, and it's not happening with Miranda. So, I mean, Dave's style is more like my sort of natural writing instinct than Miranda's, which is much more careful and measured. So what made Dave attractive was it allowed me to write in a different voice through Dave than I was in this more buttoned down, careful, methodical style I used for Miranda.
It kind of like liberated you to be more yourself as a writer?
Yeah, so I identified quite strongly with Dave in that sense, and that I could when I felt like riffing, I could riff.
Right. So obviously, like, he challenges Miranda. I mean, like, there's times when she obviously doesn't want to talk, and it's just like, let's just get through this. Mm-hmm. That, like, push-pull dynamic, how important was that in terms of like personality-wise, but also kind of like to propel things?
Yeah, it's useful. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it much, but when the minute you have more than one person, you have different types of decisions being made, and if there is that dynamic, then I mean, obviously your main character is going to do things they wouldn't otherwise. Like, they'll stay longer in places. They'll interact with people when they don't want to interact with them. And that both forces you to sort of keep fleshing out that character and emphasizing certain aspects, this insularity we've been talking about. But it's also very useful just in terms of developing ideas and plot movement, right? Mm-hmm. That because you're constantly interacting, say, with a group of people living in some deserted condominiums, then all of a sudden you're playing with a different kind of world building, and it opens up space for new ideas to come in. Yeah,
so speaking of world building, the condominium brings me to my next question is around, like, community building within the context of this story, right? Like, that there's different kinds of communities. Obviously, there's the care home situation is like, someone feels responsible for these elders. The second one is like kind of a chosen community, right? That like they're kind of very purposeful. And like, did you see these as like distinct kinds of ways of post-apocalyptic living that like, what would this look like? What would this situation look like? Who would be involved in this?
Yeah, that was part of the game, right? Yeah. Is like, okay, you've got this basic idea that you're dealing with and how do different communities respond. And then one of the pleasures of the game is you're like, okay, I'm going to think of like sort of an upper middle class or bourgeois community with, I mean, how are they going to live and how's that going to look different from sort of a working class nurse in Western Pennsylvania, right? Like how does class and worldview produce different responses to the same post-apocalyptic situation? And I mean, although it's a little episodic, that's also one of the reasons it's like a travel narrative is so useful in science fiction, is because you can it allows you to
leave those situations.
And then explore a new one.
Yeah. Tension. I want to ask about like writing and building scenes of tension, right? Because there's like points at which like something might happen, and whether it does or doesn't happen, I'm not going to like spoil the like narrative plot points, but like writing in a way that like creates tension, is that like, is it a tricky thing, or is it like is it mechanical? Like, are you thinking constructively?
No, I'm not. I'm very rarely thinking specifically about reader effect. I mean, usually I'm writing to satisfy, my own interests, and obviously that involves tension building, and so on. I do like a last sentence. I do like sort of like a climactic moment. And so often I find that I am writing to, climactic moments. And in this book, as I've already said, it's actually written for a specific moment. So in a lot of ways, a text like this, there's maybe 5 or 6 climactic moments, and I know them pretty much ahead of time, and you write to them. So it is pretty technical, it is pretty mechanical, but that's not how I experience it when I'm writing. And the tension building, it's a pleasure itself to write it, right? Because you're layering emotions and words and trying to build, I guess you are trying to build a sense of tension, and then, pull the carpet out just a little. Not that I write like for plot twists or anything like that, but it's an interesting question, and I got to think about it a little more.
Yeah, like, is it like scaffolding you're like erecting, like, because you have to reach a certain height, but then every now and then you want to shake those scaffolds to like make the person on top kind of a little anxious?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good analogy, the scaffolding, that you have to get there, and it's actually a part of the narrative itself. There's there's descriptions of scaffolding in the story. And the other thing about the scaffolding is sort of the layers and the sedimentation that's going on, and that's tied, both the scaffolding and this building of multiple tensions and then sort of withdrawing from them is also got to do with all these multiple sort of explanations for what's happening. All these different people trying to explain what's happening. So you have different narratives, and each narrative kind of reaches a crescendo, and then you move to the next one.
Right. Well, while all these people are trying to build something kind of on the like, remains of what society was, a great deal of the population is like removing things.
Right.
And was there something about having that like interplay of like removal and like destruction, and particularly like environmental destruction at the same time that other people are trying to like adapt and like renew?
I would say the short answer is no. I hadn't actually thought of it as removal, but of course it is. It's quite literally removal. I think in a lot of ways what I started thinking as I wrote it was that the two types of behavior were quite similar, actually. That all the communities were somehow trying to shape the environment in some meaningful way, but without having a real sense of the luxury I had, which was this final moment that everyone's just scrabbling in the dark, trying to pile things up. So the contrast between sort of the perceived unconscious of like the people digging the mazes and the consciousness of the people more deliberately trying to build a community, I think from my perspective, it speaks more to sort of the unconscious drive of the community builders, that they think they're doing something deliberate, but they're not really behaving that much differently than the people they perceive as thoughtless.
So this is like that notion of like purposeful work, right? Like, is this like kind of like a blue collar, white collar thing that like, there's the physical labor of the digging, and then these people in the condominiums think like what they're doing is more rarefied?
In that particular instance, I would say yes, because they're trying to recreate a certain past historical moment that at least they perceive of sort of upper middle class and bourgeois relationship to an economy. But with the religious people later and with the nurse earlier, there you see a much more concrete type of work. They're also working in very concrete ways rather than just sort of the parasitic existence of, and I don't mean that in an unkind way,
right,
of the people in Toledo.
Yeah, I was because you get kind of like differentiations between kind of like the societies they're trying to like either recreate or hold on to,
Right.
but in contrast to this, like what they see as like why are they doing this is like purposeless, mindless labor,
Activity. Yeah.
right? And so like that allows them to kind of feel better about themselves.
Yeah, and so like one of the reasons it's difficult to answer questions like that is because I made a fairly conscious effort not to try and explain to myself what was happening with the apocalypse, the post-apocalyptic situation. Like I wasn't as a writer, I had very little interest in explaining it, and that means I have very little control too of how a reader is going to perceive it and what kind of meaning is going to be
read into it. Yeah, I guess like you want to hold yourself to the same standard like the characters in terms of like they're not going to know
right
what's going on because none of them were affected or afflicted.
Yeah. And so one of the luxuries of writing the book and not knowing what was happening is that every time you're creating a new character or a new community, you have a blank slate. You can say, okay, they're going to explain it this way. And so from my perspective of sort of building up this scenario, it was this luxury of it was like a synoptic scenario where you're looking at it from different perspectives and you don't need to commit to one perspective and you don't need a big information dump to explain it because you've bracketed that entirely and you're saying this book is not about explaining the situation. This book is about describing how people respond to situations they don't understand.
Right. Did you, was it purposeful, the specific cities?
Yeah, it was very purposeful. So at the time, I was living in Western Pennsylvania. My wife had a job teaching at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and every summer we drive back with my daughter to Winnipeg, and so we would follow more or less the same route as Miranda up to we'd either go up to Michigan or sometimes around Chicago, but up to basically Minnesota, we'd follow the same route. And then in the book, they head west into Wyoming and Idaho, whereas we would come to Winnipeg. But it was very much following that route. And in fact, when I was reaching the end of it, I've got a huge amount of photographs of just sort of industrial agricultural equipment and buildings along the route.
So were you writing off of those photographs, like seeing the pictures and thinking
a little
about the terrain?
Yeah. So sometimes, particularly in the rewrite, when you're thinking about, okay, how do I describe this structure? I'd flip back and look at those photos. I really enjoy that kind of it's just an odd thing, like industry and agriculture and the environment, and that intersection is fascinating to me. And it was there every summer, so I incorporated it very much into the narrative.
Right. So you started with your endpoint. Now that the book is out and done, have you ever thought about what that story is past that endpoint?
I gotta be honest, no. And I've been asked quite frequently, and when it came out, it did pretty good, I guess, for an independent press, and I think Radiant was interested in a sequel. I wasn't. I'd kind of done what I wanted to do. I could see why someone would want something else, but to me that would be an entirely different story.
Sure enough.
One that doesn't really hold a lot of interest to me.
And it sounds like it's got to interest you for you to be engaged in writing.
Yeah.
The book is Strange Labor, out through Radiant Press. Rob Penner, thanks very much for taking some time to talk about it.
Oh, thanks for taking the time with me.